The silence in the throne room was the kind that preceded catastrophe. Serafina Voss had learned to read silences the way other people read faces, and this one, thick with perfume and contempt, and the rustling of expensive silk against marble floors, told her everything she needed to know. She was not supposed to be here. She had never been supposed to be here. And yet here she stood, at the edge of the sacred presentation circle, her plain linen dress a quiet scandal among the jeweled gowns of the women who had been chosen, truly chosen, to compete for the crown. She had been brought as a translator. That was what they had told her when the summons arrived at the servants' quarters before dawn. A folded piece of parchment with the royal seal pressed into silver wax. The High Steward needed someone who spoke all 7 dialects of the northern mountain packs, someone who could move through the ceremony like furniture, useful and unnoticed. That was Serafina. That had always been. "Serafina, do not embarrass us," Lady Isolde Vale had said to her that morning, not even turning from the mirror where 2 attendants arranged her copper hair into an elaborate crown of braids threaded with moonstones. Isolde was the most beautiful woman in the court, a fact she treated less as a gift and more as a weapon. She was the favorite. Everyone knew it. The Alpha King himself had been seen watching her during the solstice banquet, with the kind of attention he reserved for things he intended to acquire. Stand at the wall. Translate when you are told, and try not to look so. She had paused then, her golden eyes sweeping over Serafina with an expression that landed somewhere between pity and disgust. Unfortunate. Serafina had said nothing. She had learned that silence was the most effective armor available to someone in her position, and she had been wearing it for so long that it had begun to feel like skin. The throne room of the Dravos Palace was a monument to power made visible. Black stone columns rose 30 feet to a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes from the ancient wars. Wolves mid-transformation locked in eternal combat above the heads of the living. The floor was white marble veined with silver, polished to such a reflective sheen that Serafina could see the distorted image of herself looking up at her from below, wavering and uncertain, as if even her reflection was not sure she belonged here. 7 women stood within the sacred circle, each representing a noble pack alliance, each wearing colors that announced their bloodline to anyone who knew how to read them. Isolde wore midnight blue for the Vale pack of the eastern shores. There was Miriam Ashford in forest green, Petra Selene in deep burgundy, and 4 others whose names Serafina had memorized, because part of her job was to know things that other people considered beneath their attention. She stood outside the circle. Translators always stood outside the circle. Alpha. King Kaelin Dravos entered without announcement, because announcements were for men who needed the room to remember they were afraid. He simply appeared at the far end of the throne room, and the air changed. It always changed when he entered a space, as if the room itself rearranged its priorities. He was tall in the way that mountains were tall, not merely in measurement, but in presence, something that made the space around him feel smaller, not because he crowded it, but because everything else seemed to recede. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's silver eyes, and he wore no crown because the Alpha King of the Dravos dynasty had not worn a crown in 4 generations, preferring instead to let his authority speak for itself. He wore black, always black, and at his right side, 1 step behind and 1 step to the right, walked Kael. If Kaelin Dravos was the storm, Kael was the thing that existed in the eye of it, still and terrifying and absolute. Serafina had seen him before. Of course. Everyone in the palace had seen Kael. You did not miss Kael. He was the Alpha King's battle hound, the title passed down through a specific bloodline of warriors since the first Dravos king had bound one to his service through an ancient ritual that predated written law. The battle hound was not merely a bodyguard. He was something older than that, something that operated according to laws that the court only partially understood and preferred not to examine too closely. Kael stood, 6.5 feet tall, with the kind of build that suggested his human form was simply the most polite version of what he actually was. His hair was black, cut close on the sides and longer on top, and his eyes were the color of amber lit from within, gold with something moving behind them that had nothing to do with the human soul looking out. There was a scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his jaw, a relic of a battle that had supposedly killed the 3 warriors who fought alongside him. He had survived. He had always survived. That was what the battle-hound did. He did not look at the women in the circle as the king took his place on the dais. He looked at the room the way a general looked at a battlefield, assessing, cataloging, eliminating threats. His gaze moved across the assembled court with the systematic patience of someone who had long ago stopped being impressed by spectacle. And then his gaze reached Seraphina, standing at the wall with her small, leather-bound notebook and her careful, invisible posture. And it stopped. She felt it the way you felt a hand on your shoulder in a dark room. Sudden, impossible to ignore. She looked up from her notebook because she could not help it. Because the weight of that attention was a physical thing. And for one suspended moment, Cale's amber eyes held hers across 30 feet of polished marble and political theater. And something shifted in the quality of the air between them. Then he looked away. She told herself she had imagined it. She was very good at telling herself things. The ceremony began with the traditional recitation of pack alliances, each woman stepping forward as her family's representative read aloud the terms of the potential union. This was where Seraphina was needed, because the Ashford Pack's representative was an elder who had never learned the court dialect and spoke exclusively in the old northern tongue, a guttural, beautiful language that sounded like water over stone, and that fewer than 30 people in the capital could parse with any accuracy. Seraphina was one of them. She translated quietly, efficiently, drawing no attention to herself, which was an art form she had spent 23 years perfecting. The ceremony moved forward. The women were presented. The court watched with the particular hungry attention of people who understood that the outcome of this ritual would reshape alliances for a generation. It was during the 3rd presentation, when Isolde stepped forward with the practiced grace of someone who had been rehearsing this moment since childhood, that the first impossible thing happened. Cale moved. Not the small, controlled movements of a bodyguard adjusting position. He moved the way a tide moved, inexorable and indifferent to the terrain, stepping down from the dais with a deliberateness that caused every head in the room to turn and every breath to catch. The High Steward made a sound of alarm. 2 of the younger lords actually stepped backward. Cale crossed the throne room floor with the unhurried certainty of a man who had already decided something, and he did not stop at the circle, did not stop at the wall, walked past the 7 presented women without looking at a single one of them, and came to a halt directly in front of Seraphina. She pressed herself back against the wall instinctively, her notebook clutched to her chest, and looked up at him with eyes that she was fairly certain were expressing approximately 17 different flavors of terror. He was even more overwhelming up close, the amber of his eyes even brighter, the scar more pronounced, the sheer physical reality of him something that her nervous system was struggling to categorize. And then, with the entire court of the Dravos kingdom watching in absolute and thunderstruck silence, Cale lowered himself to one knee before her, and then to both knees. And then, with a slowness that felt like ceremony, like ritual, like something ancient and irrevocable, finally completing itself, he bowed his head and lay down at her feet. The silence that followed was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of a room full of people who understood exactly what they had just witnessed, and could not reconcile it with any version of reality they had previously accepted. Because a battlehound kneeling was not merely unprecedented. It was, according to the laws that had governed the Dravos dynasty for 400 years, a declaration. When the battlehound recognized a soul, that soul was claimed as belonging to the throne. The battlehound had not knelt before anyone in living memory, and he had just knelt before a servant girl standing at the wall with a notebook and a plain linen dress. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. Kaelin Dravos rose from his throne. This was not a slow movement. It was the movement of a man whose entire understanding of the afternoon had just been overturned, and who was doing the precise and dangerous work of controlling his reaction in front of an audience that would analyze every flicker of his expression for weeks. He descended the dais steps with measured precision, crossed to where Kyle lay still at Serafina's feet, and looked down at his battle hound with an expression that Serafina could not read, because she had never before been close enough to try. Then he looked at her. She had never been looked at by the Alpha King before. Servants were not looked at by the Alpha King. They were looked past, looked through, looked around. This was different. His silver eyes moved over her face with the focused attention of a man cataloging a problem he had not anticipated, and she felt the examination like pressure against her skin. Thorough and impersonal, and somehow still the most intimate thing anyone had ever done to her. "What is your name?" he said. It was not phrased as a question. "Serafina Voss," she said, and was astonished that her voice worked. "I am the court translator for the northern dialects, Your Majesty. I apologize. I do not know what he is doing. I did not do anything to cause this. I was simply standing here and he—" She stopped herself. She was rambling. She pressed her lips together and waited. Kaelin looked at her for another long moment. Something moved behind his silver eyes that she could not name. Then he turned away. "Clear. The room," he said. "Except for her." The room did not clear so much as it evacuated, because when the Alpha King used that particular tone, there was no ambiguity about whether the instruction was optional. The 7 presented women were ushered out by the High Steward, with an efficiency that suggested the man had prepared for disruptions, without having prepared for this particular disruption. Lords and ladies, and attendants and guards filed out through the great doors, with the controlled haste of people who desperately wanted to be somewhere else so they could discuss what they had just seen. Isolde was the last to leave. She paused at the doorway and turned back, and her golden eyes found Serafina's across the emptying room. And what Serafina saw in them was not confusion or surprise. It was recognition. As if Isolde had been waiting for something like this. Not this specifically, but something that would require her to rearrange her plans. She held Serafina's gaze for 3 full seconds, and then she turned and walked out, and the great doors closed behind her with a sound like finality. The throne room was empty now, except for Kaelin, Serafina, and Kael, who had not moved from her feet. The alpha energy of the room without the buffer of other bodies was a different thing entirely. She could feel it against her skin, a low hum that her blood responded to before her mind caught up. Something old and involuntary that she could not explain through any framework she had been given. She had lived in the palace for 11 years. She knew the protocols and the hierarchies and the invisible boundaries that kept everything in its proper order. None of those protocols had ever included standing alone in the throne room while the Alpha King studied her like a cipher he had not expected to encounter. "How long have you served in this court?" he said. He was not looking at her now. He was looking at Kael, or at some middle distance that contained thoughts she could not access. 11 years, Your Majesty. I came at 12 years of age. Before that, I was in the Northern Servants' Training House. He was quiet for a moment. And before that. It was not really a question. It felt more like a test, as if he wanted to see what she would do with it. "I do not know," she said, which was the truth she had been carrying for as long as she could remember. "I was told my parents died before my memory formed. I have no pack record." Another silence. Then, the name, Voss. He said it the way people said things they were checking the weight of. "It is a common enough name," she said carefully. "Yes," he agreed, in a tone that suggested he did not agree at all. What followed was the longest week of Serafina's life. Kaelin did not send her back to the servants' quarters. He installed her in rooms on the 3rd floor, previously used for diplomatic guests. rooms with a fireplace and an east-facing window, and a bed with 4 posts and curtains that could be drawn, which was considerably more than anything she had slept in for 11 years. She was given 2 attendants and told by the high steward, with the expression of a man eating something that disagreed with him, that she was to remain available for the king's questions and was not to speak to Cale under any circumstances. This last instruction proved difficult because Cale was outside her door. Not always, but frequently. She would open the door in the morning and find him sitting on the floor, with his back against the opposite wall, amber eyes open and watching the corridor with the patient alertness of someone who had never needed to move to be dangerous. He never explained himself. He looked at her the way you looked at something you had been searching for across a very long distance and had only just recognized. It was the most unsettling and somehow the most comforting thing she had ever experienced. "You are not supposed to be here," she told him on the 3rd morning, standing in her doorway in her nightgown because she had not expected him. He looked at her. He said nothing, which was consistent with his general practice. He had spoken exactly once since the ceremony, a single sentence to the high steward who had attempted to physically redirect him. "Try again." The high steward had not tried again. "I mean it," she said, pulling her nightgown's collar up with one hand in a gesture that accomplished nothing practical, but made her feel marginally more armored. "The king's orders were very clear. You should not be out here. You will get me in trouble." Cale turned his amber eyes fully to her face then, and something in his expression shifted in a way she could not quite interpret. Something that was almost amusement, but older and quieter than amusement usually was. Then he looked back at the corridor. She closed the door. She stood on the other side of it for a long moment, with her hand flat against the wood and her heart doing something irregular. Then she went back to bed and did not sleep. Kalen called her to his study on the 4th day. The study was at the end of the east corridor, a room that smelled of old books and black coffee, and something underneath both of those things. Something mineral and alive that she was only beginning to understand was simply the scent of concentrated alpha energy in a contained space. He was seated behind a desk that held more papers than seemed possible, and he did not look up when she entered, which she recognized as a power gesture so automatic he probably performed it without thinking. She stood before the desk and waited. She was good at waiting. "Sit down," he said, still not looking up. She sat in the chair before the desk, the chair that was lower than his, another design choice that was too consistent across every room in the palace to be accidental. He finished whatever he was reading, set it aside, and looked at her. The full weight of his silver gaze was something she was not sure she would ever become accustomed to. "Tell me what you know about the Voss family," he said. She folded her hands in her lap. "Very little. I know the name. I know I was told it was mine. I know I grew up without family, and that no one ever came looking for me, which I took to mean either that there was no one left, or that whoever was left did not want to be found. I learned not to inquire further." He was very still in the way that only very powerful people could be still, without fidgeting, or shifting, as if his body had simply agreed to wait while his mind worked. "And you were never curious." "I was always curious," she said. "Curiosity and inquiry are different things. I learned when I was young that there are questions whose answers cost more than you can afford." Something in his expression shifted. It was minimal, contained, but she had been watching faces for 11 years as a professional necessity, and she caught it. "What was the name of the training house where you were raised?" he said. "The Morwen House, in the Calver province." He wrote something on the paper before him. "How old were you when you first understood you had no wolf?" She paused. It was not a question she had been expecting. Most people in the court pretended not to notice. Having no wolf, no inner animal, no ability to shift, was the closest thing the werewolf world had to a stigma, a void where the most fundamental part of a person's identity should have been. Saying it aloud in this context felt like handing him a weapon. "I was told at 8 years old that I was wolfless," she said carefully. "I was told this was permanent and hereditary, and that it meant I would always be in a support role within pack society. I accepted this." He looked at her for a long moment. "Did you?" he said, in a tone that suggested he found this particular statement interesting. The answer, if she had given it honestly, was no. She had not accepted it. She had built a life around the fact of it, had structured her entire existence to make it survivable, but acceptance implied a peace that had never arrived. She had spent 23 years being wolfless in a world organized entirely around the wolf, and every single day of those 23 years had contained at least one moment where she felt the absence of it like a wound that had stopped bleeding but never healed. She did not tell him any of this. She said, "Yes, Your Majesty," and looked at her folded hands. And when she looked up, again he was writing something else, and the conversation appeared to be, for the moment, over. She was escorted back to the guest wing by a guard who was new enough to his position that he was still trying to figure out how to treat her, whether she was a prisoner or a guest or something else for which he did not have a category. She did not help him resolve this. She walked quietly at his side and thought about the question he had asked her, and the space between what she had said and what was true. And when she reached her rooms and closed the door behind her, she stood in the center of the rug and breathed and tried to understand why the Alpha King of the Dravos dynasty was interested in whether or not she had made peace with being wolfless. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. The answer came from an unexpected direction. It came from Marin, the younger of her 2 attendants, a girl of perhaps 17 with braided red hair and an honest face that broadcast her thoughts approximately 2 seconds before she had them. Marin had been assigned to Serafina's care, with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm, treating the whole arrangement as an adventure, and Serafina herself as someone fascinating, an attitude so foreign to Serafina's experience that she initially mistook it for strategic flattery. But Marin was not strategic. Marin was simply genuinely interested. On the 5th evening, while helping Serafina dress for the informal supper to which she had been inexplicably invited, Marin said, with the casualness of someone producing a piece of information she considered obvious, "My grandmother was a Voss, you know, before she married into my family and took the calendar name. She always said the Voss line was something ancient. She said they were the pack that was destroyed in the culling." Serafina went very still. The brush in Marin's hand stilled with her, catching in the mid-stroke through her dark hair. And Marin looked up into the mirror and seemed to realize that the name she had produced so casually had landed differently than she had expected. "Do you know what the culling was?" Serafina said, very quietly. Marin set the brush down slowly, as if she was recalibrating the conversation. "Everyone knows what the culling was," she said, and then stopped herself, because she was looking at Serafina's face, and something in it was telling her that not everyone did, and that this was one of those people. She sat down on the edge of the bed, which was probably not protocol, but which Serafina did not comment on. 22 years ago, Marin said carefully, there was an event that the histories call the purification of the northern lines. The court at the time, King Kaelin's father, he authorized the elimination of several bloodlines that were considered dangerous, unpredictable. They said it was because those bloodlines had been colluding with enemy packs, but my grandmother always said that was a fabrication. She said the real reason was that some of those bloodlines carried ancient power that the ruling house was afraid of, powers that the Dravos line could not control and could not match. She paused. The Voss line was one of them. The entire Voss bloodline was declared extinct. She looked at Serafina. "But you are here," she said. So obviously it was not entirely extinct. The silence that followed was the kind that changes the shape of everything that comes after. It Serafina sat with the information the way you sat with something very heavy, feeling its weight distribute through her, settling into places she had not known were empty. "How many people know this?" she said finally. "The details of which bloodlines were targeted?" Marin shook her head slowly. "It is not in the official histories. My grandmother knew because she was born a Voss before she was a calendar. She said she was spared because she had already married out of the line and changed her name, and they did not find her. But she never spoke of it publicly. She said the people who ordered it were still powerful, and that talking about it would be the same as walking into a fire." Serafina looked at her reflection in the mirror. The plain face she had always had, the dark eyes, the cheekbones that she had never thought to associate with anything, looking back at her now with entirely new implication. She was not the nobody she had believed herself to be. She was the surviving remnant of something that had been deliberately destroyed, something powerful enough that the previous ruling house had considered it a threat worth eliminating. And she was in the palace of the son of the man who had ordered that elimination. And his battle hound had lay at her feet before the entire court. She did not go to the informal supper. She sent word that she was unwell, which was technically accurate in the sense that the new information she was carrying had done something significant to her equilibrium, and she spent the evening sitting by her window, watching the moon rise over the palace walls and thinking through the architecture of her own life with completely new tools. Every piece of it looked different now. The training house, the way she had arrived there as a small child with no memory and no name beyond Voss, the deliberate erasure, the fact that no one had come looking for her, the fact that she had been allowed to grow up in the shadow of the very court that had ordered her family's destruction, so invisible that no one had ever bothered to identify what she actually was. And underneath all of it, the persistent absence she had carried her whole life, the wolfless void, the space where her other self was supposed to live and never had. She thought about the way Kaelin had said, "Did you?" when she told him she had accepted her wolflessness. She thought about the way Kael had stopped when his gaze found her across the throne room. She thought about what it meant that the battle hound recognized a soul that the court had spent 2 decades insisting did not exist. She was so deep in thought that she almost missed the sound at her window. Kael was crouched on her window ledge 3 floors above the courtyard, balanced there with the easy precision of a predator who had never concerned himself with gravity. He was in simpler clothes, dark trousers and a shirt open at the collar, and his amber eyes in the moonlight were the color of flame. She should have been more alarmed than she was. The fact that she was not alarmed told her something significant. "You cannot be on my window ledge," she said. He stepped into the room and looked at her with the thoroughness of being read, then crouched before her chair so they were approximately level. "You know something now that you did not know before," he said. It was not a question. She looked at this impossible person who had shattered the political order of a kingdom by lying at her feet, who was now crouching in her guest room at midnight, speaking to her as if she were someone worth speaking to. "I know I should not be alive," she said. "According to someone's plan, approximately 22 years ago, I should not exist." Something moved in his expression that looked briefly like pain. "Yes," he said. "I know this." She went very still. "You knew," she said. "How long?" He met her eyes without flinching. "Long enough," he said. "Too long." She stood up because sitting suddenly felt like the wrong position for what she was feeling. "You knew who my family was and said nothing, while I have been standing in the walls of this palace for 11 years being nothing, because no one told me I was something." The anger surprised her. She had been taught it was a luxury she could not afford, but it had apparently been waiting for permission. "You do not understand the full situation," he said carefully. "Then explain it to me," she said. "I have spent my entire life not understanding the full situation, and I am finished with it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down on the floor, crossing his legs deliberately, putting himself at a level that required her to look down at him. It was a gesture that understood its own meaning. The Voss bloodline carried something called the Aegis, he said. An ancient gift, older than the pack hierarchy as it exists today. The ability to anchor, to hold reality steady against forces that destabilize a pack's ability to function. Illusions, corruption, chaos magic. When the previous king began working with forces that operated through exactly the kind of destabilization the Aegis would have countered, he needed the Voss line gone. She processed this. The fire crackled. And the wolflessness, she said. Is it real? He met her eyes. The Aegis suppresses the wolf. All carriers of the bloodline experienced it. It is not wolflessness. It is a wolf so deeply merged with the Aegis that it cannot be accessed by conventional means. It requires a specific kind of activation. And you, she said. Why are you telling me this instead of the king? He looked up at her from the floor, and his amber eyes held something she had no name for yet, but recognized in the way you recognized a song heard once in early childhood. Because the battle hound serves the truth before he serves the throne, he said. And because you have been kept from the truth for 22 years, and I am tired of being complicit in that. She looked at him for a long time, then said, You should probably leave before someone notices. He rose with fluid ease and crossed to the window ledge. I am never far, he said. Then he stepped off the ledge and was gone. And she crossed to the window and looked down at nothing but pale stone wall and empty courtyard. She pressed her hand flat against the cold glass and breathed, and let herself, for the first time in her life, be something other than nothing. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. The meeting with Kaelin the next morning was different from the ones that had come before it. She knew now that knowledge changed the texture of a room, and she walked into his study carrying a different weight than she had carried the previous times. The weight of someone who has stopped believing that the gaps in their understanding are accidents. He was already looking at the door when she entered, as if he had heard her before she knocked, which was probably true in ways she was only beginning to understand. He looked at her for a moment, that was just slightly longer than administrative, and then he said, Kael came to your rooms last night. It was not a question. She met his silver eyes directly. This was new. She had not met his eyes directly before, had defaulted to the practiced avoidance of the practiced servant. Yes, she said. He told me about the Aegis. He told me about the culling and what it was actually for. She watched his face. He did not look away. He did not do anything that could be read as guilt, which she found both interesting and insufficiently convincing. What else did he tell you? Kaelin said. Nothing, she said. Which is why I am asking you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood from his desk, and she noticed that he came around it rather than staying behind it, closing some of the distance between them, standing on the same side of the furniture as her. It was a small thing. It was not nothing. My father ordered the culling, he said. I was 17 years old when it happened. Old enough to know something was wrong with it, not yet old enough to stop it. I have spent 6 years trying to determine whether any of the targeted bloodlines produced survivors. He paused. When Kael made his declaration in the throne room, I recognized the name, Voss. It was in the records I had been reviewing. A child of the Voss line, female, age approximately 1, given to the Morwen training house under a false identity in the days before the culling was carried out. Someone in your family managed to hide you before the end. She thought about that. A faceless person. Someone who had loved her enough to hide her before they were taken. Someone whose name she did not know, and whose face she had never seen. She breathed through it. Later. She would process it later. Why did no one come to retrieve me after? She said. When you were searching. He looked at her steadily. We were looking for a wolfless girl with the surname Voss. Your file listed your name as Voss, but your registration at the Morwen house was under a different family name that was changed when you transferred to court service. We found you 3 months ago." She processed this. 3 months ago," she said, "and you did not tell me." "I needed to be certain," he said. "Certain of what?" He was quiet for a moment. "Certain of what the aegis in your blood would mean for the current threats to the kingdom," he said, and she heard the layers in it, the things he was not saying inside the things he was. "There are people in this court who would have wanted to ensure you remained unfound," he said. "People who served my father and who have not adjusted their loyalties since his death. If I had announced your identity without proper preparation, without understanding the extent of your gift, you would have been in danger." She looked at him. She thought about Isolde, and the way Isolde had looked at her in the throne room when the doors were closing. That particular look of recognition. "Lady Isolde," she said quietly. He did not confirm it. His expression did not change in any way that she could point to as confirmation. But the fact that it did not change, that it remained precisely the same, was its own kind of answer. "There are political forces in this court that have a significant interest in who sits beside me on the throne," he said carefully. "Forces that would find a woman of the Voss bloodline profoundly inconvenient." She stood very still with all of this moving through her like weather, like something that had been held back for a long time, finally finding the path it had always been meant to travel. "What happens now?" she said. He looked at her. The silver eyes, which she had spent 5 days categorizing as impersonal, were not impersonal when you were close enough to see into them properly. There was something there that she had no name for yet, but that she recognized in the way you recognized a song you had heard once in early childhood. Not the melody exactly, but the feeling of the melody. "Now," he said, "I would like to understand what you can do, if you are willing." She thought about wolflessness. That was not wolflessness. She thought about an anchor ability she had never known she carried. She thought about 23 years of being invisible in a world that had seen her as nothing, and whether nothing had perhaps been the most efficient camouflage available to something that turned out to be quite a lot. "I am willing," she said. The training began in the lower practice fields, at an hour early enough that the morning mist was still thick against the ground, and the castle walls were rose-colored with the first light. Kale met her there before Kaelin arrived, because Kale was always somewhere adjacent to wherever she was, and she had stopped pretending not to notice. He showed her the first exercise without speaking, which was consistent with his general communication style. He stood at the center of the field and shifted, not to his wolf, which would have been the conventional display, but to something in between, larger than human, not quite fully transformed, the kind of partial shift that required extraordinary control and that most wolves could not hold for more than a few moments. In this form, his amber eyes were different, more animal, less managed, and the energy he radiated was something that pushed against the air around him like a physical force. She felt it pressing at her. She felt her own blood push back. That was new. That was something she had not felt before, or perhaps had felt and had no framework for. The sensation of something inside her meeting an external force and holding against it rather than yielding. "What are you doing?" she asked. He returned fully to his human form. "Testing the boundary," he said. "Do it again," she said. He looked at her, and she thought she saw something in the amber of his eyes that was the older, quieter version of what she now understood was satisfaction. He shifted again. She stood her ground, and this time she did not simply let her blood push back on instinct. She paid attention to it, the way you paid attention to a muscle you had always used without noticing, identifying it, locating its specific weight and response. She felt it like something unfurling in the center of her chest, not dramatic, not the way the stories described power awakening, just a slow, certain unclenching, A thing that had been held tightly for a very long time finally allowed to extend. The mist around her feet moved. It moved against the wind, pulled toward her as if she had created a small gravity, and Kale's pushed energy did not reach her. It stopped at a distance of approximately 3 feet, as if it had struck something invisible and solid. Kalen arrived as the mist was receding. He stood at the edge of the practice field and watched what was happening with silver eyes that she was learning to read with increasing accuracy, and what she read in them now was not impersonality. It was something considerably more complicated. He came forward when Kyle stepped back, and he looked at her with the field still settling around her and said, "The Aegis." "Apparently," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and then turned to Kale. Something passed between them. Not words. The kind of communication that happened between two people who had been in each other's company through enough significant moments that they had developed a shorthand for the unsuitable ones. Kale's expression remained even. Kalen's expression remained controlled. She watched this exchange and understood that whatever was happening between the three of them had been happening in some form since long before she arrived in this field, and that the political and the personal and the supernatural were all threaded through each other in ways that were going to take time to separate. "We train 3 times a week," Kalen said. "The exact nature of your ability is still emerging. Until we understand its full scope, I want its existence known only to those of us here." He looked at her steadily. "There are people in this court who will attempt to harm you if they understand what you carry. I need you to be careful." She thought about Isolde, about the eyes at the closing door, about the weight of a political situation she was only beginning to see the full dimensions of. "I have been careful my entire life," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression shifted in that minimal, contained way she was becoming familiar with. "I know," he said. "That ends now." She was not entirely sure what he meant by that, and she was not entirely sure he was certain either. But she filed it away next to the other things she was collecting, the small pieces of a picture that was taking shape around her with the slow certainty of something that had always intended to arrive. The weeks that followed had the quality of a held breath. Serafina trained in the mornings and performed her official duties as translator in the afternoons, and the court arranged itself around her new position with the tortured dignity of people who had no idea what category to put her in. She was not a servant anymore. She was not yet anything else. She lived in the guest wing and moved through the corridors with an escort she had stopped arguing about, because Kale had explained that 2 attempts had already been made to access her rooms when they were believed empty, and that whoever was making those attempts would escalate. Isolde moved through this period with the serene composure of a woman who had decided not to be threatened by something she had not yet fully identified. She was gracious to Serafina in public, with a graciousness so precisely calibrated it communicated exactly the opposite of its surface meaning. She was never anywhere near the incidents Serafina was increasingly certain she was orchestrating. On the evening of the 3rd week, one of Serafina's attendants disappeared, her belongings cleared out, a transfer request filed the previous afternoon. The timing was specific, because that attendant had been present when Serafina discussed the Aegis exercises with Kyle in a corridor she had believed was private. 2 days later, Serafina found a note under her door in unfamiliar handwriting. "The dead do not rest when their bloodline is threatened. They remember everything." She brought it to Kalen immediately. He read it without visible expression, and then looked at her with those silver eyes that she was now convinced saw things she could not. "It is a warning," she said. He agreed. "From whom?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I am not certain," he said, which was the first time she had heard him express uncertainty, and it shifted something in her perception of him. A small but significant shift, because uncertainty in powerful people was either weakness or honesty, and she was fairly sure which one this was. "There are factions in this court that predate my reign," he said. "Some of them served my father genuinely. Some of them were coerced. Some of them are simply afraid of what changes to the power structure will mean for their own positions." What I cannot yet determine is which of these factions is actively dangerous and which is simply—" He paused, selecting the word with visible care. "Discomfited." "Isolde?" she said again. And again he did not confirm it and did not deny it, and the shape of the not denial was its own species of confirmation. "I need to know," she said. "I understand discretion, and I understand that you have political considerations I am not fully aware of, but I am the person at risk, and I need to understand what I am at risk from." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze. He said, "Isolde Vielle is the daughter of the most powerful alliance pack in the Eastern Territories. She has been positioned for this court since she was a child. She has people inside the palace, in positions ranging from kitchen staff to the lower council. Whether she ordered anything directly, or whether certain things are being done in anticipation of her preferences rather than on her instruction, I cannot yet prove." He paused. "But yes, I believe she understands what you are, and I believe she considers you a threat that she will act against if she believes she can do so without consequences." Serafina sat with this. She thought about the girl who had told her not to look unfortunate, who had swept through every space she occupied with the certainty of someone who had been told her whole life that the space belonged to her. She thought about the fact that she felt no particular hatred toward Isolde, which surprised her somewhat. What she felt was something closer to a weary recognition. Two people, arranged by forces larger than either of them, into positions that were structurally incompatible. "What are you going to do?" she said. He was quiet for a long moment. "I am going to do what I should have done 6 years ago," he said, and offered nothing further. And she decided to trust that the thing he was not telling her was not something he was choosing to hide from her, but something he was choosing to be certain of before he named it aloud. The convocation was announced 3 days later. The announcement spread through the court like a lit fuse, and Serafina heard it first from Marin, who appeared at her door with bright eyes and barely contained energy. "He has announced a convocation," Marin said. "A formal mate claim convocation, before the pack leaders." She looked at Serafina with a significance so pointed, it was nearly a physical object. Serafina sat down on the bed, because her legs had made the same executive decision they made the night Kale first spoke to her. "He has not told me this himself," she said. "No," Marin agreed. "I expect he is doing that now." He was. The knock at her door came 20 minutes later, a single considered knock rather than the sharp administrative kind, and Kalen was there alone, without guards or escorts. He entered and remained standing by the window and said, "I had intended to tell you before the announcement was made. The timing was not what I planned." "What are you claiming?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm claiming you." The words were simple and direct, in the way that complicated things sometimes were, when all the complicated parts had been worked through in private. She looked at him, and thought about all the things she had believed about herself for 23 years, all the careful, protective nothing she had constructed. She thought about what it meant to be claimed by the Alpha King of the Dravos dynasty, all the political weight, all the ways it would change every single thing. She thought about Kale and the mate bond, and the three of them threaded into the same knot. And Kale, she said. Kalen's expression held the recognition of a thing being named that he had been waiting to see named. "The battle hound claimed you first, before I had the information I needed to make my own declaration. According to the old law, that claim has equal validity. I am not asking you to choose. I am telling you that both claims exist, and that the law has provisions for this circumstance. Ancient and rarely invoked because the circumstance is ancient and rare." She thought about provisions. She thought about an anchor designed to exist between two forces. "When is the convocation?" she said. 4 days, he said. "What do I need to do?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Be there. Let the truth be witnessed. Everything else follows from that." She looked at him and thought about what trust was, whether it was a thing you decided or a thing that accumulated until the weight of it became indistinguishable from certainty. "All right," she said. 4 days. The 4 days between the announcement and the convocation were the most densely complicated 4 days of Serafina's life, and this was a meaningful distinction for someone who had spent 23 years navigating invisibility. The first complication was Isolde, who requested a private meeting through channels that were technically optional, but socially mandatory. Serafina accepted the meeting, which Kale thought was inadvisable, and which Kaelin thought was necessary, and which she thought was unavoidable, regardless of anyone's opinion on the matter, because she was not the kind of person who could organize her behavior around avoidance. They met in the East Garden in the late afternoon, the two of them and the complicated space between them. And Isolde was precisely as she always was, beautiful and composed, and radiating the particular energy of a person who has decided that being fully seen is a form of vulnerability they will not risk. She was wearing pale gold that day, which was the vile pack color for formal negotiations, which told Serafina something about how Isolde was framing the conversation before a word had been said. "I wanted to speak with you before the convocation," Isolde said, without preamble. Her golden eyes were steady. "I think it would be useful for both of us." "Then speak," Serafina said. She was standing in the garden in the plain but nicer dress that had been acquired for her at some point in the last week without her asking, and she was standing with her hands at her sides and her spine exactly straight, and she was not apologizing for any of it. Isolde looked at her for a moment, and Serafina saw, underneath the composure, something that she had not expected to find there. Not fear, not malice. Something that looked considerably more like exhaustion. "I have been positioned for this role since I was 5 years old," Isolde said. "My entire life has been organized around a single objective. I am not telling you this to ask for sympathy. I am telling you because I want you to understand that my behavior has not been personal. I have been protecting an investment that every person who has ever had power over my life has made on my behalf, and I have been doing it by any means available." Serafina looked at her. "The transfer request for my attendant Cella," she said. Isolde held her gaze. She neither confirmed nor denied. "The note. Under my door," Serafina continued. "That was not from me," Isolde said. And something in the quality of her voice was different on this point. More direct, more precisely chosen. "I want you to understand that. Some things that have happened in this court in the last 3 weeks were done by people acting in what they believed were my interests. I did not order all of it. I did not order that." She was looking at Serafina with an intensity that felt like trying to land something important. "The factions that my father's alliances created in this court are not entirely under my control," she said quietly. "Some of them have objectives that extend beyond me, beyond my marriage or lack of it. People who were complicit in what happened 22 years ago, and who have very specific reasons to want to ensure that the evidence of what happened stays buried." Serafina went very still. "You are telling me," she said slowly, "that there are people in this court who know what I am, and who will move against me regardless of your marriage outcome." Isolde looked at her. "I am telling you," she said carefully, "that if you survive the convocation, which I believe you will, there will be people whose response is not to accept the new order, but to destabilize it, and they will target whatever they believe is most effective." She paused. "I am not your ally," she said, "but I am not your enemy in the way you may have believed, and I think you should know where the real threat is coming from." The silence in the garden was full of everything neither of them was fully saying. Serafina looked at this woman who had told her to make herself small, and who had apparently also been made small in different ways by different forces, and felt the complicated thing that sometimes arrived when you looked clearly at a person you had organized your understanding around and found that they were more human than the story you had been telling required. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. Isolde looked at her for a long moment. "Because I was raised for power, and I understand the value of accurate information," she said. "And because the people I am warning you about are dangerous to me as well, now that I am no longer useful to their specific agenda." She straightened. The composure was fully restored, the glimpse of something underneath it sealed away again as efficiently as a door closing. "I would not call this a warning given freely," she said. "Consider it an exchange. The nature of the exchange can be determined by whether we both survive the next week with our positions intact." She turned and walked back toward the palace, and Serafina stood in the garden in the afternoon light, and understood that the geometry of what she was navigating was considerably more complex than she had believed even an hour ago. She went to Kaelin with this information immediately. He listened without interrupting, which she had learned was how he listened to things that mattered. "She identified specific individuals?" he said. "Not by name," Serafina said. "But the shape she described is consistent with the lower council members installed during your father's reign." He was quiet again. "I have been building a case carefully," he said, "because moving against council members without sufficient evidence would create the kind of instability that would give them exactly what they want." She thought about that. "The convocation is the event around which they will move," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "A disruption at the convocation, witnessed by every pack leader in the kingdom, would be the most effective destabilization available to them." She thought about the Aegis, about training in the practice field at dawn, the mist moving toward her, the slow, certain unfurling in her chest. "I am an anchor," she said. He was very still. "If they attempt something at the convocation, I could hold the space," she said. "Counter whatever they bring to bear, the way the Aegis was designed to do." "You do not know the full extent of what they might use," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I have been carrying a gift I did not know I had for 23 years, designed specifically to counter exactly the kind of forces that operate through corruption and illusion. I am done being protected from things I was made to address." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw in his silver eyes the thing she had been seeing for weeks, but labeling as impersonal, finally readable. It was the recognition of something you had been waiting to find for long enough that you had stopped naming the wait. "Kael knew," he said quietly. "The moment he saw you. He always knew." She thought about kneeling, and amber eyes and midnight windows. "Yes," she said. "I think he did." The night before the convocation, she could not sleep. She lay in her bed with the fire burned down to embers, and the silence of the palace pressing around her, thinking about all the things she was carrying into tomorrow, the Aegis and the knowledge of her bloodline, and the 2 claims under the ancient law, and the threat that was not finished. She got up eventually and wrapped herself in the thick robe that had appeared in her wardrobe at some point, and she went to the window. The moon moved slow across the slice of sky above the palace walls, and she thought about what it meant to be the surviving remnant of something deliberately destroyed, whether survival was itself a kind of answer to destruction. She thought about her family, whoever they had been, however they had loved her enough to hide her before the end. She would never know their names. She had 23 years of being alive as the only evidence of their choice, and she decided, sitting at her window in the last dark before everything changed, that she would carry that evidence carefully and make it mean something. She was still sitting at the window when the dawn came, slow and gold across the palace walls. When it had fully arrived, she stood and dressed herself in the gown that had been left for her. Dark blue shot through with silver thread, and she looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment and saw, for the first time, someone she was beginning to recognize. The convocation was held in the Great Hall, which was larger than the throne room, a space designed specifically for gatherings that required the witness of the entire pack leadership. Every alpha representative of every pack alliance within the kingdom's borders was present, seated in the tiered arrangement that indicated their relative standing within the hierarchy. and the room was full in a way that had an almost physical weight to it. Hundreds of people carrying hundreds of years of accumulated pack authority in a single space. Serafina walked in with Kyle one step to her left and half a step behind, which was not precisely a traditional arrangement, and which caused exactly the kind of ripple through the assembled witnesses that she had anticipated. She was not announced. There was no title to announce. That was the point of the convocation. The form the day would take was itself the announcement. She had been given a position in the front of the witness area, which was typically reserved for those with the highest pack standing, and she stood there and kept her spine straight and her hands still, and let the room look at her, because she was done making herself small enough for other people's comfort. Kalen entered last, as the Alpha King always did, and the room changed with his entrance in the way it always did, everything recalibrating around the fact of him. He walked to the center dais without looking at her, which she understood was not indifference, but ceremony, the ancient form of the convocation, requiring that the claiming be done in the specific sequence of the ritual. He faced the assembled pack leaders and spoke the opening declaration in the old language, the formal one, that she translated in her head as she listened, words about lineage and truth and the duty of the throne to the pack. Then he turned. He turned and looked at her across the assembled witnesses with silver eyes that were finally fully visible, not contained, not controlled in the way he controlled them in private, but open in the way that only public declaration required. And she felt the weight of it, like a hand extended. "I claim before witnesses," he said in the formal tongue, "the one who carries the aegis blood of the Voss line. I claim the right recognized by the battle hound under the ancient law. I claim Serafina Voss as mate, as queen, as anchor to this throne." The room was very quiet. Then Kale moved. He moved to stand beside her, not in front of her, not between her and the dais, but beside her, and his voice, when he spoke, was in the same formal tongue. "The battle hound confirms the claim," he said. "The recognition stands. The soul is bound." There was a moment, stretched and full of everything it contained, and then, from somewhere in the tiered seating of the pack leaders, a single voice said, "I object." The voice belonged to Lord Casvin of the Western Marshes, a man of 60 with the bearing of someone who had been planning this moment and had not expected to still be planning it this week. He stood from his position in the third tier and addressed the room with the practiced delivery of a speech, prepared and held in reserve. "This claim is irregular," he said. "The woman in question has no pack standing, no verified bloodline record, and no wolf. The ancient law regarding the battle hound's recognition was written in a time when the criteria for such recognition were understood differently. I move that the claim be reviewed by the full council before any formal recognition is granted." There were murmurs through the assembled pack leaders. Not universal agreement, but not universal disagreement either. The murmurs of people. Calculating, which was what pack leaders did when the political wind shifted. Serafina felt the room the way she had begun to feel rooms in the practice field, as something with texture and weight, a space with pressures and counterforces. She felt something else as well. She felt the aegis stir in her blood like a tide responding to the moon, something ancient and specific identifying the nature of what was happening in this room with the precision of a gift that had been designed exactly for this circumstance. Casvin was not the only force here. Behind his voice, underneath the political maneuver, she felt something else, something that moved through the room at a frequency below the audible, a kind of interference, the same quality that Kale's shifted energy had carried in the practice field, but darker, more deliberately structured. Someone in this room was doing something to the space, something designed to make the ceremony feel wrong, to introduce doubt into the minds of the Sao. Witnesses, to subtly corrupt the proceedings at the level of perception rather than argument. She knew what this was. She had been made to know what this was. "No," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried, the way voices carried when they were backed by something that had nothing to do with volume. Every head in the room turned toward her. She was not supposed to speak yet. There was a sequence to the convocation, and she had not been asked for her part of it. She spoke anyway. "There is an active working against this ceremony," she said in the formal tongue, because she spoke 7 dialects, and the formal tongue was one of them, and had been since she was 16. "I can feel it. It is moving through the room at a level below the spoken arguments. Someone here is using corruption, working against the proceedings, which is a violation of convocation law that supersedes any procedural objection." The room was very quiet. She felt Cale beside her, steady and absolute. She felt Kaelin on the dais, watching her with silver eyes that were open in a way she would need to learn to look at directly when this was over. She breathed, and she let the aegis extend, not forcefully, but completely, the way you opened a hand you had held closed for too long, and the working that was moving through the room hit the edges of it and stopped. She felt the moment it encountered the anchor. She felt the people in the room feel it, the change in the air as something that had been subtly wrong became clean. The collective sense of a pressure releasing that most of them had not consciously registered was present until it was gone. Across the room, in the 4th tier of the pack leader seating, a woman she did not know went very still with the expression of someone whose mechanism has just been removed from the machinery. The woman looked at Serafina, and looked away, and looked back, and Serafina held the space steady, and breathed, and let the aegis do what it had always been made to do. Casvin's objection lost its momentum in the changed air of the room. He looked around at the assembled witnesses and found them less receptive than they had been 30 seconds before, the interference that had been seeding doubt no longer operating. He attempted to continue, but the formal argument could not support its own weight without the working behind it, and after 2 more sentences, he stopped. In the silence, another pack leader, the oldest woman in the room, the matriarch of the EI, Solène Line, who had served in 6 convocations and whose opinion carried more authority than any procedural motion, rose from her seat in the 1st tier. "I have witnessed," she said in the formal tongue, "the aegis working openly in this space. I have not seen the aegis in my lifetime. I have not seen it because the bloodline that carried it was declared eliminated 22 years ago by an action that this convocation," she paused deliberately, looking around the room, "was never asked to sanction." Another silence. "I recognize the claim of the Alpha King and the confirmation of the Battle Hound," she said. "And I move that the procedural record of this convocation note that the action taken against the Voss bloodline 22 years ago is subject to formal review by the assembled pack leaders, as that action lacked the required convocation sanction that the law demands for the elimination of any recognized bloodline." She looked at Lord Casvin. "I further move that the individuals who orchestrated and who benefited from that unsanctioned action be named and examined." She sat down. The room was very quiet. Lord Casvin sat down as well, more slowly, the calculation in his eyes now aimed at exit strategy rather than objection. Serafina felt the aegis settle around her like something that had found its resting position after a very long time of being displaced. She let out a breath that felt like it had been held for 23 years. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming? What followed was not tidy, because things involving centuries of political structure and deliberate historical crimes never resolved tidily. The formal review of the culling took 3 months, and produced testimonies that rearranged the political landscape with the quiet thoroughness of a tide going out. Lord Casvin and 4 members of the lower council were removed from their positions and referred for formal judgment. The woman in the 4th tier, Lady Rosalind Ferna, who had been embedded in the palace by a network of former loyalists to the late king's extreme advisors, was identified, and that network methodically dismantled. Isolde Vale left the court 2 weeks after the convocation and returned to her family's eastern territory, her departure not quite exile, because the investigation confirmed her role was significantly less than the people who had used her. Position as cover. Serafina received a letter from her 3 months later, short and precisely worded, acknowledging that the landscape had changed and that the Eastern Pack Alliance sought continued positive relations with the Dravos court. She gave it to the diplomatic secretary for formal filing, which was the correct and gracious response. The question of the mate bond and the shared claiming under ancient law required the most careful navigation of all, because it was the most personal and least mapped by existing precedent. The provision existed in the law for the same reasons the aegis had existed, because the architects of the ancient system had understood that an anchor between two forces needed to be bound to both. Living that provision required honest conversation in stages, some truths available only in the space created by other truths being spoken first. Kale told her, in the East Garden on an afternoon 2 weeks after the convocation, that when he had seen her in the Siu throne room, it had felt like finding something he had not known he had lost. He said that he had expected to recognize his mate and find someone who needed teaching, and he had found instead someone who had been teaching herself the world for 23 years without the tools she was supposed to have. She felt the warmth of this, in the specific, quiet way of something that had always been true, finally being named. Kalen told her, in his study on a firelit evening, that he had been afraid. She found this startling. He said he had been afraid of making a claim based on something real rather than politically alignable, because political territory had always been more controllable than genuinely wanting someone, and he had a long relationship with preferring controllable territories. She said that she thought they had both been very well controlled for a long time, and it had been making them smaller. He smiled. It was the first real smile she had seen from him, the contained quality. Entirely absent, and it changed his face into something entirely his own. The third conversation was the 3 of them together, in a private sitting room that was not anyone's official space. And it was not comfortable, because important things rarely were. But it was honest, and it produced an understanding that was not compromise but finding. The specific configuration of 3 people genuinely suited to each other in ways the law had made provision for, because the law was old enough to have seen this before. The coronation of Serafina as queen of the Dravos dynasty was held on a clear morning in the early spring, when the mountains to the north were still capped with snow, and the courtyard of the palace was full of the cherry trees that bloomed every year, with indifference to political events. The ceremony was traditional in most respects, and unprecedented in one, which was that the battle hound stood at the queen's right side throughout the ceremony, a position that the law permitted, and that no one had seen occupied within living memory. Pack leaders came from every territory. The matriarch of the Selene line sat in the first position of the witness tier. Marin stood among the attendants and cried with the cheerful completeness of someone who had decided weeks ago that this moment deserved it, and was not going to do anything to hold it back. The crown that was placed on Serafina's head was not heavy in the way that she had expected, having always imagined that crowns were primarily defined by their weight. It was precise. It sat on her head with the specific, considered pressure of something that had been made to fit, something that knew where it belonged. She stood with her spine straight, and the aegis settled around her like something that had finally, after a very long time of being displaced, found its resting position, and she looked out at the assembled witness of the kingdom and felt, for the first time in her life, the full and uncomplicated fact of her own existence. Not the fact of her survival, not the fact of her usefulness, the fact of herself, present and real and taking up exactly the space she was supposed to take up, and taking it up without apology. Kaelin looked at her with silver eyes that were fully open, and Kale stood at her right with amber eyes that had not stopped knowing her since the moment they found her across a polished marble floor. And she thought about a girl who had stood at the wall with a notebook and a Plain dress and a careful invisibility. She had been practicing her whole life, and she thought about what the girl had not known she was carrying, and she thought about what it meant that the carrying had not broken her, but had simply been waiting, patient and ancient, and absolutely certain, for the day she would finally be in the right place to set it down and let it become what it had always meant to be. She had been the anchor all along. She was still the anchor. But she was also the queen. And those two things were not in opposition. They were, as the ancient architects of the Aegis had apparently always understood, exactly the same thing.